A lot of diplomatic conversations that he's had. This was the most power-packed event. With electrifying energy of the Indian diaspora, the Prime Minister addressed the Indian diaspora along with the Australian Prime Minister in the audience. The Prime Minister here hailed the ties between India and Australia. He's also announced that soon there is going to be a consulate in Brisbane, and I think we'll also have highlights of what the Prime Minister has said. You're looking at those images also coming in from that entire event. And this is just a quick reminder that today in the evening, starting at 7, we will in fact replay those big moments, those significant moments. But right now, the gentleman that you see on your screens actually needs no introduction. He's only looking serious, but he loves to crack a joke or two. He loves India. He loves the Indian democracy. He's just met with the Indian Prime Minister. We'll also try to put out that picture out on our screens in a moment as I say good evening to Salvatore Babones, who's joining us right now. Salvatore, good to talk to you. You've had a meeting with the Prime Minister. You both shook hands, then you both sat down. The Prime Minister was reading from something. I don't know what you gave him, but why don't you tell us more about that meeting? First up.
He was reading my op-ed in today's Australian Financial Review, which was saying that Australia needs a policy on India that's driven by data, not drama. The real problem is that so much of our international discussion about India is so drama-driven. It's, somebody has a story they want to tell about India instead of actually coming to the data about India. The data about India are so positive that, to hide them is a crime in itself. So he loved that the newspaper op-ed appeared this morning in Australia's major financial newspaper, emphasizing that we need to talk data when we talk India.
Okay, and Salvatore, because you've spoken about that article, I was reading through that article, but before, we talk about that article, a lot of people have been wanting to know that how did Salvatore get interested in the Indian democracy? Over the last many weeks, many months, we've seen you all over the Indian media. You hold a very, very strong social influence. People say you're an influencer. Yeah. You've been in India, you've traveled abroad. Right now you're in Australia. So from where did this, love for India really begin? And what's the best thing that you like about India and the Indian Prime Minister?
It's funny because I've been writing about India for 4 or 5 years now. In fact, I had a book about the BRICS economies where I wrote the chapter about India. That was a 2016 book, if I remember right. So I've been very interested in India for a long time. What specifically I've been writing about in the last year or so has been India's democracy, because we have a situation in India where we have a truly, and I use this word advisedly, a truly extraordinary democracy. And by extraordinary, I mean not ordinary. If you look at the profile of an ordinary democracy is a rich European or North American country that is broadly secular, not a lot of religious attendance, and is generally progressive in mindset. Now you compare that to India, which is a deeply conservative, deeply religious, developing country. Well, on the statistics, we would not expect India to be a democracy, but there it is. It is a democracy. So that's what motivated my research and what got me, well, unexpectedly famous or infamous, depending which way you view it, in India, was simply that I went to the numbers and I said, all of this vilification of democracy that I hear in the West, all of these negative sentiments about India simply aren't supported by the data. Not only that, the activist narrative criticizing Indian democracy isn't even supported by the activists' own data, which is the incredible thing. So that's what went viral in India. I suddenly 6 months ago picked up 70,000 new followers on Twitter. Now, I don't consider that much of an influencer in Indian terms. Indians have 1 million, 2 million, 9 million Twitter followers. That's not me. I don't speak the local language. I'm local languages. I'm simply doing my best to say something interesting and meaningful about Indian democracy.
And Salvatore, though you're being very humble, but you must tell us how can one actually go viral with the kind of things you've said about the Indian democracy, about a lot of Indian politicians, that clearly has gone viral. It's found a lot of resonance, particularly in the audience that has been watching a lot of this Western media narrative also. And because you spoke about vilification, why don't you push that point a little further? Who really are these people today who have a problem with a growing and an emerging India, with a prime minister who's so popular that the Australian prime minister, literally Salvatore, calls him, quote unquote, the boss?
Mostly what goes viral is humor, and I really enjoy humor. In fact, I write a political humor column or a cultural humor column here in Australia, focused on Australia. So I've just taken that to Twitter, and almost all of the tweets I have that go super viral are because there's something funny about them, and I do enjoy that. Some people say that I shouldn't be funny because I'm supposed to be a serious, academic, and I tell them, if you want serious debate, don't go to Twitter, go to my academic papers. That's where we have a serious discussion. But all of that humor is always poking fun at something for a reason. I'm not a comedian. I'm there on Twitter to say to people who are telling lies out there, the activists with an agenda who want to warp the data in their favor. Well, I like to not only show them what they're doing wrong, but show it in a way that catches people's fancy, right? I never like to be negative towards anybody. Actually, I challenge people to go through my entire, I think, 10, 12 years of Twitter and find anything negative I've said about anybody. I just don't do that. And people seem to for all we talk about, Twitter's full of negativity. People enjoy the positive message, and I enjoy making it. Now, who am I making fun of? I'm mainly making fun of people who maybe take themselves a little too seriously, but also people who say ridiculous things, like, the organizations that say that there's a 10% chance of a genocide in India in the 2020s. That's just ridiculous. The people who say that India is on the border between being a fascist state. That's just ridiculous. Or one of to give you a concrete example, one of the funniest things I've seen on the internet is that the RSS is a, quote, paramilitary organization. Now, I'm not a member of the RSS. I'm not even Hindu. But the idea that a bunch of mostly middle-aged and elderly men, running around with lathies, that they are somehow paramilitaries, making them the equivalent of guerrillas in a forest with AK-47s, that's so ridiculous that it's laughable. And so when I make fun of things, I'm making fun of them because the people are themselves being ridiculous in what they say.
Oh, yes. And I think it's important also, Salvatore, to ask you this quick question. A lot of our viewers want to know, what was the atmosphere like? When you were there in the audience there, you've written about this, that let's see how the Australian media actually covers this. What is the kind of coverage that this event actually got there back in Australia? Why don't you just, tell us more about the entire atmosphere? It's, I think electrifying is an understatement right now, with the kind of crowds and with a kind of very, very warm reception that the Prime Minister got.
This is absolutely a party for the Indian-Australian community, and it's their party. I want to emphasize to them, this event was not organized by the Australian government. It was not organized by the Indian government. It was not organized by anybody except the members of the Indian-Australian diaspora themselves. They threw themselves a party. And if I had to guess why Mr. Modi continued on his trip to Australia, despite the fact that the Quad Summit was relocated to Japan, that Joe Biden canceled his planned visit to Australia, I'm confident that the reason he's here is not actually for, no offense, Mr. Albanese, no, it's not actually here for the Australian Prime Minister. He's here for the Indian-Australian diaspora, for those 20,000 people who not only bought tickets, but who had already booked airplane flights to come from Brisbane and Melbourne, the people coming in on buses from all over the east coast of Australia into this stadium. You have to realize that an event like this only comes around once every 9 years in Australia. And the last time it happened It was when Mr. Modi visited Australia 9 years ago. Also, Australian politicians don't have big stadium rallies. This isn't the United States. This kind of celebrity politician culture is unknown in Australia. This was probably, well, not probably, this rally in Sydney tonight, was the biggest election rally that Mr. Albanese has attended in his entire political career in Australia. In fact, the only larger rally he's ever attended is the one held 3 months ago in Gujarat in the Narendra Modi Stadium. So this really is a spectacle for Australians.
Oh, yes, and that was also for Prime Minister Modi. Now, I just want to dwell on this article that you'd penned, and I think the article that the Prime Minister was also reading through. The title, viewers, is The Most Popular Politician in Australia. Now, who really is this most popular politician in Australia? I'll let Salvatore tell us that. And also very briefly, here's a point where, Salvatore, you mentioned that 9 years into his government, Mr. Modi today enjoys a 72% approval rating. And you say this puts him in a strong position for the next year's parliamentary election. Some might say too strong. Now, in the middle of this reading, do you believe that there are challenges also today for Narendra Modi as the Prime Minister, as a world leader that he's emerging?
Of course, there are domestic political challenges in India. A year is a very long time in politics. Obviously, Mr. Modi is the man to beat, but India does not have a presidential system. If there were a presidential election in India, obviously Mr. Modi would win over any one challenger. But India has a parliamentary system, and the prime minister's persona can only go so far in convincing people to vote for their local MPs. As we say in America, I live in Australia, but I am American. All politics are local. And in the end, if opposition parties were to have as effective a campaign strategy as the BJP does, if they got their ground game together, if they really put on a good performance and made a solid challenge to the BJP, there's no reason why they couldn't win the 2024 election. Now, I'm not predicting, I'm not, as you Indians say, a cephalogist. That's an India-specific term. We don't have that. It's Indian English only. We don't have that term in the West. I don't predict elections. I merely point out that elections are always they're always a gamble, and you never know who's going to win. Now, as for Mr. Modi's reputation abroad, of course, that reputation is stellar. And that's a massive change in the last 10 years. Before Mr. Modi became prime minister, let's not forget, there were serious concerns in Western countries about his fitness to serve and whether they would receive him. In fact, there was a big debate going on in the United States in 2014. Should Barack Obama be willing to meet with Narendra Modi? Now, all of that debate is now gone. And it's gone largely because of Australia. The then Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, was the first Western leader to invite Mr. Modi on a state visit. Narendra Modi came to Australia. He gave that big rally out in, I believe it's the same stadium that was now called the Kudos Arena here in Sydney. And he addressed a joint session of Australia's parliament. And seeing that in Australia, Mr. Modi was welcomed with open arms in a bipartisan way by both sides of Australian politics, I think is what convinced Barack Obama and the rest of the Western world that Narendra Modi was someone they wanted to work with, was someone to deal with. And of course, the next 9 years simply cemented his position at the top of global diplomacy. It's hard to think of any leaders in the world today who are more respected than Mr. Modi. And I say that not as some kind of sycophant. I say that realistically. I ask people to name. I mean, certainly not Joe Biden. Joe Biden doesn't have that sort of global respect that Mr. Modi does. Certainly not Xi Jinping. He's a leader of a totalitarian country, he's a totalitarian dictator. Does anyone in Europe have that stature? Maybe Rishi Sunak will in 5 or 10 years, but he doesn't have it yet. It's hard to think of someone who rises to his stature on the global stage today.
All right. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. We've completely run out of time. Otherwise, I would have asked you also about your books and a lot of other things, Salvatore, that you do. And you clearly haven't told us what the conversation between you and the Prime Minister was like. Did you give him any tips, or did he give you any tips? Because clearly both of you are very, very popular. But yes, I think what we'll also do is, over the course of the next many weeks, as India is rightly into an election season, Salvatore, there's going to be a lot more politics to discuss, to talk, to opine with you. For the moment, I thank you for your time, your perspective, and for speaking to us on Republic. Thank you.